Welcome, friends. In this continuation of my book review series, I'm going to be tackling another French book translated Simon the Magician. This book is by Florent Heinz, and it's an excellent piece of work that I want to make more available to English-speaking people. A lot of its conclusions, which are very good, have yet to seep into English-speaking scholarship on Simon of Samaria. And so, without further ado, I present this book review. For those of you interested in looking up this book for yourselves, I provide the full bibliographical information here. It is, in French obviously, Simon le Magicien, and the title can be translated Simon, in quotes, the Magician, Acts 5 to 25, and the accusation of magic against wonder-working prophets in antiquity. I can't cover the whole book in all its rich detail. Suffice it to say, Heinz proposes a critical model for studying the accusations of magic in ancient texts, and then applies those results in an analysis of Simon, chiefly in Acts 8. So the procedure is to observe that the accusation of magic is universal in antiquity, and it's applied to all sorts of figures and people. It's part of a standard repertoire of invective. When you don't like someone, or you want to trash someone's reputation, you call your opponent or your enemy a magician, and there are certain stereotypical features that a magician has. The ancients didn't exactly have our word magician. They used words like magos, or mage, and goes, which can be translated sorcerer, as well as planos, meaning deceiver, and words such as these. Chapter 1 is chiefly a history of research, in which Heinz goes through the patristic tradition and modern research, and he shows that there are several responses to the Book of Acts. If you haven't read this chapter in the Book of Acts, go read it. I've got presentations of this chapter on my Patreon. Basically, the author of Acts says that Simon was practicing magic. The Greek word operative here is mageuon, and that he did or performed works of magic, which is mageis in the dative case. So most have concluded at face value that Simon was a magus, and in fact, this term magus becomes an ossified label that is glued to Simon in later patristic literature, and which continues, unfortunately, today. The question is whether we should accept this portrait of Simon in Acts, given the fact that it is part of a trend or a convention in the ancient world to accuse people of being a magus even when they were not, or when they did not claim to be. And elite people were trained in the course of their education in the arts, the rhetorical arts of invective, in which they tore down the character of their opponent by sophisticated operations of name calling. And in addition to name calling, were associated with other negative or pejorative terms, ideas, or practices. In short, we need not accept the portrait of the author of Acts that Simon of Samaria was a magus. We never hear from Simon of Samaria. He may have called himself something else. Maybe he viewed himself as a wonder-working prophet and was simply called a magus or a charlatan because the author of Acts wanted to attack him. We also have to deal with this possibility. In an honor and shame culture, such as we have in Greco-Roman antiquity, rhetoricians spent years learning the techniques to shame vices and supposedly vicious people by the techniques of invective. They went to school to learn these sorts of things. They learned speeches of praise, they learned speeches of blame, and these were standard topics in the ancient syllabus. So this is really important to keep in mind. these techniques of invective are not just in speeches, but they're in narratives as well. So when an author writes down a narrative, he already is trying not to simply describe reality, but to create a reality such that he shapes your perceptions of the events in such a way that his version of reality is impressed upon yours. And what we want to do as critical readers is to resist and to some extent read against the grain. That is to understand this shame culture and the use of invective in literature, and to, in some way, counteract it, to read behind it, through it, as it were, between the lines, to see if we can get actually anything accurate about Simon at all. Anyone, and I mean anyone, could be accused of being a magus. It didn't matter who you were, a simple politician, someone selling on the street. If you were someone's enemy, you could be called a magus. And particularly, people who were powerful and successful were sometimes called magoi, or people who were engaged in magic. Now, there are two ways of making someone into a magus. One can make a simple assertion that an opponent is a magus, or one can associate one's opponent's deeds with the deeds of a magus. So when one lacks evidence, one simply uses the technique of association. Well, he or she does something like a magus. He or she carries around a statue, or he or she bathes in a particular way, or he or she goes into the closet at night, shuts the door, and whispers we know not what. If one can associate one's opponent with magical deeds, that's saying something like this person amounts to a magus, even though they are not, or they don't claim to be a magus. So we see this binary or dualistic pattern in antiquity, that we have cases where in speeches some people are blamed and some people are praised. So also in narratives, we have long narratives in which ancient wonder workers are praised and justified. For example, the life of Apollonius by Philostratus and the Gospels, obviously, as well as Philo's life of Moses and Josephus's depiction of Moses in the Antiquities. All these are extended narratives defending a particular wonder worker, usually defending them against charges of magic. While there are other works of literature whose sole aim, it seems, is to defame thaumaturgs or wonder workers as magicians. And a good example here is Celsus's True History, Lucian's Peregrinus, as well as Lucian's book Alexander the False Prophet. These are texts which try to take down the wonder worker, to make him or her into a magus, and to destroy their reputation, even when the wonder worker in question never claimed to be a magus and never did things such as, say, spells or drown cats or wear amulets that even resembled magical practices. So this is important to keep in mind. So basically, Heinz calls us toward a more critical reading of the literature, and specifically of Acts 8, when it comes to understanding who is a magus or not, and why should we think so. He gives his principles of method and gives examples of the application of that method. And in this case, there are the examples of Eunice of Epamia in Diodorus of Sicily, and of the Egyptian prophet in Josephus. And these are examples that set up the discussion of Simon in Acts 8. Heinz outlines at least 4 ways of treating an accusation of magic in ancient literature. One can simply accept it at face value, as most people accept the portrait of the author of Acts, that Simon of Samaria was a magus. But one can also think that the accusation is false, but might have some basis in fact. Here, again, when we look for evidence that Simon was a magus, we would want to find things like the use of amulets, or the use of potions, or the sending of demons, or the use of love charms, or whatever. We don't have any of that in Acts. A third option is to reject the account altogether as biased, which is, of course, a possibility. We can simply throw out Acts 8 as a reliable source for Simon because the author of Acts was, it seems, intent on destroying Simon and the influence of his group. Or the fourth option, which is the one that Heinz illustrates, is that one can critically read a text and take it in measure as a potential source for historical details that have to, as it were, be brought out of it, extruded from the text in between the lines through a careful inquiry. And there are certain methods for doing that in a correct way, and there are certain ways that one can bring out in the most plausible way what might have happened without ever making a dogmatic claim that this must have happened or this must be the true story behind the false narrative. No, we want to use the evidence of the text itself to determine what is or is not plausible in the case of Simon. Heinz wants to arm his readers with knowledge for how one should treat these accusations of magic. And he gives certain principles, the first being that one should always distinguish between claimed and imputed magic. When we're reading an ancient text or whatever, a piece of papyrus or an inscription, we want to determine whether the figure who is impugned with magic actually claims to be a magos or is simply called a magos ex post facto by someone trying to polemically destroy this person's character. A second technique is to distinguish between assertive and metaphorical attacks. These are Heinz's way of talking about whether an author actually asserts that someone, their opponent, is a magus or simply associates them with the character or deeds of a magus, and that's the metaphorical approach. And third, Heinz encourages everyone to learn the stereotypes that were used against magicians in antiquity. There was a finite set of things and associations that were used against magi or mages, and we can figure out what those are. When we see what's stereotypical, we can distinguish the stereotypical from other more unique or distinctive claims and try our best to reconstruct who the accused person actually was. And so finally, the curtain opens on the main meal, as it were, in chapter 3, where Heinz rereads Acts, chiefly Acts 8, 5 through 25. And he identifies 7 common stereotypes of magic and 4 circumstantial distortions that are used in Acts 8. And identifying these things helps us determine what is and what is not reliable in Acts 8, and also helps us to reconstruct what seems to be more plausible about Simon's practice and character. The 7 stereotypes used against magicians are as follows. Number 1, magi or magicians in the ancient world are thought to use spells or charms or some other kind of magical materials, such as amulets or love potions or what have you. And it's interesting that in Acts 8, Simon doesn't use any of these. He is merely said to astound the crowds, and we know not how. But he isn't putting pins in dolls or doing other sorts of magical operations. He's not using special formula or weird names of gods or weird languages. He is simply being himself and having good success in the heartlands of Samaria, apparently as some sort of prophet and wonder worker. The second stereotype of magicians is that they stupefy people, and particularly gullible people. And one gets the sense that for the author of Acts, the people of Samaria are on the gullible side. They go from following Simon being head over heels to changing course and attaching themselves, fawning on Philip, who brings the gospel to the area. Another stereotype of magicians is that they're very arrogant. And part of that arrogance is, number 4, that they deify themselves, or they portray themselves as a divine figure. So this is very common, and as the author of Acts says, Simon was calling himself somebody great, which for the author of Acts is definitely not a good trait. It's something that Theudas does in Acts 5:36, and something that leads to his destruction. Simon also doesn't deflect the praise of the Samaritans around him, who say that he is the so-called great power of God. And much like is in the case of Herod in Acts 12, you're supposed to deflect that sort of praise. In the case of Herod, he doesn't, and is eaten by worms and dies. Magicians also, in the 5th stereotype, are thought to monetize or market the sacred and to use it for their own greed. And many authors have, again, who take the account in Acts at face value, have claimed that the fact that Simon asks Peter to gain authority to transmit the Spirit is a manifestation of greed, even though the text never says that Simon then planned to sell the Spirit. That is sort of assumed that that is what he's going to do, simply because he is a magus. The magus, or magicians, magi or magicians, are also thought to be evil within, clever creatures who may pretend to be something but are something else. And in this case, it's often the case that some scholars and religious readers will take a page from the patristic authors who say that Simon's conversion was feigned, that he really wasn't sincere, that he was inwardly evil and just trying to gain control over people, and so he never truly became a Christian. This is a reading with a very long history and is probably not faithful to the text. And finally, magicians are thought to be inherently irreligious and subject to divine punishment, that they, will be eventually punished, if not by the state, then certainly by God. And it's interesting that in the text of Acts 8, this really isn't assumed of Simon. Simon, in the end, begs for forgiveness, and Peter even tells him to repent. And so the possibilities, in other words, are open for Simon. He's not damned or cursed or thrown out of the community. Simon's later history is never reported, but the doors aren't closed on his faith. Heinz also discusses 4 ways that the author of Acts distorts the presentation or the character of Simon in Acts 8. First of all, he points out that Simon's message, which Heinz believes is a message of salvation, is reduced to a message of self-adulation. In short, we never really know what Simon says. That is, if he had a doctrine, that is taken away from him. And all that we learn about him is that people adored him as the great power. And that's it. So this is a way of distorting by omission. If Simon did say and teach something that was concrete, that has been omitted, and all that we see of him is some kind of braggart. Second, another distortion is that Simon attracted fickle crowds and had no firm disciples. It's never said that he starts a community. We don't even know why he's a threat to the author of Acts. All we know is that the crowds follow him, and then these crowds do a 180 and start following Philip. So Simon, in a sense, is abandoned. The third distortion is that the author of Acts gives subtle hints that Simon really didn't convert. And this occurs in the speech of Peter, where Peter somehow by clairvoyance knows that Simon's heart is not right and sees in Simon in the chain of injustice. And these are allusions to idolaters and other vicious people in the Hebrew Bible. So Simon is his character is read by Peter as someone who is an idolater and who's someone who is not really right with God, despite the fact that Simon's character really is not clear at all, and the only thing that he does is desire to transmit the Holy Spirit just like the apostles do, even offering money. And the fourth distortion is that Simon is portrayed as subordinating himself to the apostles. This is probably not historically correct. Simon is almost groveling at the end of the account, begging for apostolic prayer. And if Simon made such an impact in Samaria, it's probably the case that he didn't submit to apostles. He may never have met the apostles. These apostles may simply have been brought into the account by the author of Acts in order to rubber stamp Samaria as connected to Jerusalem somehow in an apostolic mission. But this apostolic mission may never have happened. And Simon certainly is not the kind of character who, as a native of Samaria, would grovelingly submit to apostles from Jerusalem. Simon is the kind of character who would, much like Paul, claim to be an apostle himself, or at least to have equal authority with those called apostles. So these distortions have to be kept in mind whenever anyone reads the book of Acts. Again, the author of Acts is trying to create a reality about Simon, and it's important for critical readers not to accept that portrait as if this is somehow the absolute truth. After his own attempt at historical reconstruction, Heinz concludes that Acts 8 doesn't present Simon as a Gnostic redeemer, such as we see in the patristic sources and as was argued by Ernst Henschen in the mid-20th century. Neither, however, is Simon a syncretistic magician, as also patristic writers take him to be, and as the modern writer Lucien Cerfeau said that he was. The almost universal presupposition that Simon was a magus, and that his name is Simon Magus, so of course he must be a magus, this is thrown out by Heinz in favor of the view that Simon was probably some sort of Samaritan prophet who proclaimed not himself but the restorer, sometimes called the prophet like Moses, a person who is later referred to as the Taheb. Not exactly a Samaritan Messiah, but something analogous to the Jewish concept of Messiah. And in the course of proclaiming this message, Simon, like Jesus, performed wonders. But since Simon was viewed as a competitor of some sectors of the Jesus movement, the author of Acts vilified him as a magician whose doctrine was false and who could thus be dismissed, perhaps absorbed, but more likely dismissed from Christianity. According to Heinz, Simon would have self-identified simply as a prophet who worked wonders, and he was genuinely converted, not by the apostles necessarily, but by a message of Christianity, and that as a Christian and as someone who had led a community before the gospel came to that area, Simon was a logical choice for a leadership position, but that he was denied this position and caused some sort of break or schism in the early Christian network. Much later, the story of Acts was molded to exclude Simon and to uphold the apostles, Peter, John, and the deacon Philip, at Simon's expense. In other words, Simon is, to some extent, subdued by being absorbed into Christianity, but his Christianity is questioned, and he is never portrayed as receiving the Spirit, and he is never portrayed as giving it either. So any threat that Simon, as an early Christian leader who was not connected to Jerusalem, posed was thereby diffused. And there you have my whirlwind summary of this fantastic book. You can use this video and think more about how your reading of Acts 8 has changed as a result of the insights proposed by Heinz. I want to thank everybody now for coming along. It's been a pleasure having you, and if you have benefited from this series in any way or from any of my videos, please consider supporting me. I have lots more material on Simon of Samaria on my Patreon, and I welcome everyone to that platform where I can engage with you and answer your questions. For the moment, I wish everyone well and hope that you continue your journey of learning and seriously pursue the critical study of the biblical texts. Take care.